In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear audience, I am going to make a video on post-colonial literary theory. Well, dear audience, we should remember that post-colonial literary theory, it is a method of interpreting, reading and critiquing the cultural practices of colonialism, where it proposes that the exercise of colonial power is also the exercise of racially determined powers of representation. Before I go on to discuss, we should have a historical context of post colonial literary theory. In the 16th and 17th century, we should remember the British, they were turning into industrialization and they were in favor of minting money. In industrialization, they were able to produce lot of money, but they thought that it was not enough. So they started looking for some other places like Asia, like Africa, like South America, where they can find some places so that they should be able to sell their products over there. So it started in the 17th and 18th centuries. And somehow or the other, they colonized so many countries of the world. Of course, it was not just, the political or economic endeavor that they were making. They had another mission in their mind. And that mission was that they wanted to civilize the other nations of the world. In post-structural theory, we have already read that there is a binary which was created, that there is West and there is East. So West is always superior and East is always inferior. So they thought that it was incumbent, compulsory on them that they should move on and colonize the other nations of the world. Franz Fanon in 1960s talked about that how this concept of other was created, and this other, which is the inferior other, they always made their representation against these people. So they considered them that they are the savages, that they are the pagans, and whatever they are not. So they always considered themselves the superior nations of the world. Fanon wrote two different books: The Wretched of the Earth, White, Black Skins, White Masks, where Fanon talks about that what kind of representation they are making in their text and talk. So it was not just the force, the political force or the economic force that they were using to control these people. Rather, they were producing the representation of such type of nations through text and talk. So the discourse that they were producing and the kind of representation that they were making in them of the inferior nations, of the nations who were not well equipped to cope with them, they were economically inferior. So they always represented them that they are the savages and pagans of the world, and it was their job to civilize these nations. Later on, we come across Edward Said in 1970s. He wrote a book, Orientalism, and it is considered the one of the books on post-colonial literary theory. In Orientalism, Said talks about again the binary system which was created by the West, where they always represented themselves and the inferior nations of the world as other. So Said says that they needed such type of discourses so that they should manipulate them. Edward Said saw colonialism as a project that was undeniably military as well as political. However, colonialism also had a discursive component. That is, the primitive or pagan East was the literary discursive creation of the European imagination that then begins to be accepted as true. So they produced the text in such a way that these natives of the Asian countries of the African countries, of the South American countries. They accepted that they are our masters, and whatever representation, the stereotypical representation that they are producing, it is right. So when you consider that their discourse is right, the images that they have produced, they are telling all these things in a right way. So it means that in Althusserian concept, they are interpolated. Post-colonialism questions the effect of empire. It raises issues such as racism and exploitation, assesses the position of the colonial or post-colonial subject, offers a counter-narrative to the long tradition of European imperial narratives. So when we read, Heart of Darkness, we see that the kind of representation they have made of the native people, it is so heinous. They present that these blacks, they are so black that even their heart is black. So the kind of, graphical representation that they have made of their, country. So we read that even the water, the rivers which are flowing in this country, they are black. The sun, when it shines, it is also black. So much so, they say that when Kurds, he stays there. He was an intelligent person, but because of the blackness of this country, Kurds also lost his senses and he became black. Then in another text, for example, a passage to India, we have seen the kind of, conspiracy that they carried out against Dr. Aziz. And Dr. Aziz is blamed for that he is interested in Arala question. So when we read and reread such type of texts closely, we try to understand what kind of colonial representation they have made. Edward Said is of the view that we should do the contrapuntal reading of the text, which means that we should read against the grain to see that what kind of representation, what kind of images they have produced about the colonial people, where they stand, how they are presenting them. So in any kind of text that we are reading, we will come across that the representation of the black people, of the Asian people, it is very bad. For example, in Mansfield Park, we also come across in Antigua, they have got the resources which were basically the resources of the natives of those countries, but they exploited those natives and they captured their land and then they earned money, and in this way they were running their houses in Britain. Then we find that there are some psychological effect of colonialism on the native people of the country. For example, Fanon talks about the psychological aspects of colonialism, and he says that people, they lose their identity. Baba also talks about identity. Baba says that we have got the natives against which these masters, they compare themselves, and they needed these natives because whatever these natives were, these masters, they were not like that. So if they were black, they were white. Okay, if they were uncivilized, they were civilized. So Baba also talks about hybridity. Baba also talks about mimicry. The natives, when they have internally, you know, understood that they are the way they are stereotypically presented, it is true, and they try to copy their masters. They try to put on the clothes the way their masters they put on. They try to follow the practices that their masters they are doing or carrying out those practices. So in this way they lose their identity and they become hybrids. So of course the hybrid person, he has got identical identity issues. So Baba talks about hybridity. Baba talks about identity crisis. Said also argued that European identity in the 18th and 19th century evolved through a confrontation and engagement with such non-European cultures. Europe and the other were discursively represented in literature and history as binary opposites. So this is what I have just talked about. Orientalism is a style of thinking, a form of representation that created opinions, ideas, and images of the non-European culture in racialized ways, so that the East was always contrasted negatively with Europe, and it justified the colonial presence in the East. So when they were contrasting themselves and they were saying that these pagans, okay, they are the people who are not well developed, they are uncivilized, okay. So in this way they made it possible that they should be present in their countries. So they were bringing the education system, they were trying to have the religious system, okay, in which the people should follow the practices, the culture of their masters. So it was not just, the coercively they are making people accept them as their masters, but it was through discourse that they were manipulating the natives of Asia, Africa, and South America. Later on, with the passage of time, many countries, they got independence. So then the nomenclatures, they were changed and created. For example, first of all, New Zealand and Canada and Australia, they got independence and they were given the name dominions. But when they did not accept their hegemony, so of course then they were given the status of independent countries. Later on, Pakistan and India, they also got independence. In effect, Said's work showed how discourse and rhetoric, language and writing were essential to the colonial project, because writing and rhetoric are ideological. So the ideology of empire required certain forms of discourse to support and justify it, and Orientalism was this discourse. The task of post-colonial literary criticism has been to locate modes of representation, narratives where Europeans constructed the natives in politically significant ways. Of course, they were creating discourses in the form of poetry, in the form of novels, and the task of the post colonial writer is to read these novels, poetry, and read against the grain and show resistance to the colonial ideology which is there in the text, and see that how they have constructed the natives, how they are presenting them with the help of binary, where they are always superior and the natives, they are always inferior. Colonial discourse is racialized, of course, and because racial discourses feed directly into the imperial colonial system, the task of post-colonial literary studies has been to unpack those literary figures, themes, and representations that have enforced imperialist ideology, colonial dominance, and continuing Western hegemony. So the task of the post-colonial reader, critic, is to read against the grain, to see the kind of images that they have produced in their colonial texts, that what kind of representation they are making, how they are constructing the natives of those countries. English literary texts are neither universal nor simply about human values. But in liberal humanism, we have read that they have talked about that literature is for the ages, that their literature, the kind of values that they have put in them, it is universal. But remember, English literature is never universal, and the kind of values that they have depicted in them, they are never universal. So you should read against the grain and you should challenge such type of literature. Post-colonial literary theory attempts to focus on the oppression of those who were ruled under colonization. Factors include political oppression, economic, social, cultural oppression, psychological oppression. So, of course, they created such type of system here because the people, when they will be ready, having got their degrees, they should serve their masters. So they should serve by putting on masks on their bodies. They will have black skins, but their masks will be white. And in this way, they will always remain, you know, in identity crisis. Ideologically, they will suffer. Psychologically, they will suffer. So This is a kind of oppression that you will find which is discursively produced in their text and talk. Reinterpretation in post-colonial literary studies involves paying attention to the context in which English literary texts were produced and to work colonial ideologies through these texts. Those who were formerly colonized, they were oppressed. In post-colonial theory, the word colonized can mean many things. Literal colonization, more abstract colonization, African American, Native Americans in the United States. Post-colonial theorists believe that the colonizers imposed their own values onto those colonized so that they were internalized, socio-cultural, socio-culturally they were colonized. Well, in the end, I have talked about that the job of the post-colonial literary theorist is to read against the grain, to read the text, see that what kind of words they are using, what kind of sentences they are producing, what kind of images, symbols, metaphors, and metonymies they are using in the text, and how discursively they are constructing the natives of Asian, African, and South American countries. So read against, show resistance to the ideology which is depicted in the text, see that how they are representing them, and when you expose these colonial ideologies in the text, you are giving it a resistance, you are carrying out a post colonial analysis of the text. Thank you very much.